Would just like to introduce our speaker for today and then hand over the floor to Erik. So Erik van Sebille is a physical oceanographer who investigates how the ocean currents move stuff around. He's an associate professor at Utrecht University and has been awarded the 2016 European Geosciences Union Ocean Sciences Division Outstanding Young Scientist Award and a 2019 James B. McElwain Medal from the American Geophysical Union. His fieldwork has brought him to the Atlantic Ocean, the Indian Ocean, and Antarctica, but these days you can mostly find him behind his computer. So without further ado, thank you so much, Erik, for joining us today. And now the floor or the screen is yours.
Well, thank you, Delphine. Well, yeah, so to kick off this seminar series, I wanted to kind of take a little bit of a step back and to ask ourselves, well, we've been doing this plastic research now for perhaps 15 years or so. And what are at least in my opinion, what are the key pressing open questions that we have? The things that we really don't know and that we should know as a scientific community for us to really give the kind of guidance and the kind of support and the kind of information to stakeholders, to policymakers, to the general public who find this ocean plastic such a big problem and are so interested in it, but on the other hand, don't really know what to do. I'll give you a hint of the answer already. There will be 3 pressing open questions. And in this half hour or so, I'll slowly go through them. So plastic in the ocean really started back in 2004, I would argue. And that is with this very famous paper by Richard Thompson and his co-workers in Science, who took data from 2 lines, CPR lines, so continuous plankton recorder lines in the North Atlantic between the UK and Iceland, and between the UK and the islands over here. And they found a lot of plastic, but they found not that much very small plastic. So they wondered, where is all the plastic? And they started out with this question, lost at sea, where's all the plastic? This really spurred the field of ocean science plastic. And spurred it has, because I go to the next slide now, this is a figure from a very, very recent paper led by Wynne Cowger, who has tallied all the papers since 2005 that use the word microplastics on environmental sciences in the Web of Science. And as you see here, it's gone from only a handful or so 10 years ago to more than, or almost 800 in the year 2019. And in even a few months of 2020 that are in the data set, already more than 500 of these papers. So clearly, the world has taken on, or the scientific world at least, has taken on the question of microplastic. Many, many of us are doing research in this. So you think, well, then it's all solved. With hundreds of papers a year, surely there can't be anything more that we can research. Well, fortunately for us, that's not true. Fortunately, there's plenty of things still to research. So I started getting interested in the plastics back in, say, 2012 or so, when we did this paper where I deployed a lot of, or I helped deploy a lot of drifters into the ocean, a large data set run out of NOAA, the Global Drifter Program, with thousands and thousands of these kind of drifters in the ocean. And I use these drifters to get a bit of a feeling for how ocean plastic would move on the surface currents. And this is what that looks like. You see that over time, this is a simulation of how plastic moves from all the continents around the world into the ocean gyres. You see that there are 5 regions at least where all this plastic ends up. Here in the North Pacific Ocean between Hawaii and California, here in the North Atlantic Ocean, in the South Pacific Ocean, the South Atlantic Ocean, the Indian Ocean, up here even maybe in the Arctic. All of these areas are what we call accumulation regions. And the ocean currents are such that at least a floating plastic all ends up in the center there. The question then is this true? So this is only a model, of course, so this is a simulation. So even though that this was an analysis of the drifting buoys, many people hadn't really seen any of these garbage patches before. It was only years later that people starting to investigate whether there was indeed plastic there. And this is a paper by my good friend and colleague Cara Levenelot, who has taken thousands and thousands of samples of plastic at the surface of the ocean. She uses manta trawl nets like this from a ship, trawls it for a mile or so, and then tries and figures out or counts the amount of plastic that she sees in the nets. Now, if you do that in the Pacific Ocean, in the North Pacific Ocean, what you see here, then you find that in most areas of the Pacific Ocean, there's actually hardly any plastic, less than a few thousand pieces per square kilometer or so. But right here in the middle of what we could sometimes call the garbage patch between Hawaii and California, concentrations really go up to more than 100,000 of pieces per square kilometer. So indeed, even in the observations, there is this big accumulation of plastic. Here it is shown for the Pacific Ocean. It's now also been observed in the South Pacific, in the Atlantic Ocean, in the Arctic Ocean. Everywhere we go, we find in the middle of the oceans these gyres. Now, many of you, or hopefully not many of you, but at least many in the public, think of these gyres as islands of plastic. You don't want to know how often I've been asked whether I've ever stood on the island of plastic, as if it is some kind of place where you can go with a ship and then plant a flag or something. It's not like that. This is not what the garbage patches look like. This is not what the accumulation zones look like. I think that a much better image of what the garbage patches look like is actually this. This is a photo from one of Charles Moore's papers, where he took a trawl in the North Pacific Ocean, so in that area, the bullseye that we just saw on the slide before, and he looked at all the pieces of plastic he found in 1 nautical mile of ocean. So 1 nautical mile of ocean gives you this amount of piece of plastic. And you can see that some of the items are still recognizable. Here's a bottle cap ring, here's a piece of straw, but most of them are completely fragmented, tiny, tiny pieces of plastic. Now, if you count the number of plastics here, and if you multiply that by the area of ocean sampled, it's a mile long times roughly 60 centimeters wide or so, you would indeed get to roughly 1 million pieces per square kilometer. Which sounds like a lot until you realize that there's 1 million square meters in a square kilometer. So here in the ocean, in the middle of the garbage patch, we're really talking about 1 piece of plastic per square meter. That is what people call the plastic soup. For years, I've been trying to get a new phrase in, the plastic bouillon, because I think it's much more a very, very thin bouillon than it is a true soup. Now, so we have these samples, not only Cara's samples in the Pacific Ocean, but also many, many other samples. And a few years ago, I worked hard together with a lot of my esteemed colleagues to get a data set of as many of those samples as we could. You can see them all over here. Every dot here is somebody who took a trawl through the ocean to sample the number of pieces of plastic in the ocean. You see that the North Pacific is reasonably sampled, the North Atlantic is somewhat sampled, but many of the other oceans are very, very poorly sampled. And even since 2015, it's not grown that much because it is just a lot of work to do this sampling. Now, with this sampling though, we can combine that with the type of models that I've shown before. The type of models that showed how the plastic moved into the centers of the gyres. And if we combine that, we can get to an atlas, the total amount of plastic floating on the surface of the ocean. And if we have that, then we can just count all of that up. And if we do that, we come to this, that the total amount of small floating plastic on the surface of the ocean is something like 15 to 51 trillion particles, weighing 93 to 236,000 metric tons. That is the amount of plastic that we've mapped. that we know roughly where it is, that we have an estimate of where it is around. All this small floating plastic. And we think that this is a very large number, that this is a very problematic number. But the thing is that this is actually a very tiny number. 236,000 metric tons is very, very small compared to all the plastic that we think has gone into the ocean ever. And we don't really still have a good estimate of exactly how much plastic has gone into the ocean. But the most famous number out there is from a study by Jenna Jambak in Science in 2015. And she estimated that in the year 2010 alone, more than 5 million tons entered the ocean. Compare that to the less than 250,000 tons that we now know is floating at the ocean. And you would see that in one single year, more than 20 times more plastic entered the ocean than is floating at the surface of the ocean right now. And this is going on year after year after year. So I would say that really there's probably this 250,000 ton is probably less than 1% of all the plastic in the ocean. And if that's true, then that means that of 99% of all the plastic that has ever gone into the ocean, we actually don't know at the moment where it is. It could be in a water column. It could be on the ocean floor. It could be on coastlines. It could actually be too small to measure. The nanoplastics that people start talking, that my colleagues and I start talking about now, that are so small that we don't really yet have good methodologies. Or it could be so small that it's actually already been completely eaten away by bacteria. And of course, most worryingly, it could have gone into biota, into the marine life. Now, we don't know how much is in each of these reservoirs. We have no idea where this 99% missing plastic is. I sometimes say that it is dark plastic, that just like astronomers have dark energy and dark matter, we have dark plastic. But it's not really true in some ways, the comparison with dark energy and dark plastic, because astronomers really don't know where to look. And we almost have too much places to look. Because every time my colleagues and I go out into the ocean and look for plastic, we almost always find it. Everywhere in the ocean is plastic. On the ocean floor, if you go there with a submersible, like the people at the Monterey Bay Aquarium are doing, they very often see plastic. If people take sediment samples, there was a paper in Science a few weeks ago of sediment samples just off the Italian coast in the Mediterranean with a lot of plastic in there. People find plastic on coastlines everywhere. We've now started to find, and as I will show in a few slides, also the ocean cleanup has started to find plastic in the water column. So all of these reservoirs, we know that there is plastic. We just have no idea how much is where, how this 99% of all the plastic is distributed. And I would argue that we do need to know that, because how can we ever figure out what the harm of all this plastic or how to clean up this plastic is if we don't even know where the plastic is? Now, people of course have tried figuring out where all this plastic is. And the point is that you can kind of make everything work. These are two papers that came out a few years ago. The left one by Bart Koolmans, in which I was also involved, where we modeled, we used a very, very simple model, a very idealized model of fragmentation and sinking of plastic, going from microplastic to microplastic to nanoplastic, and all of that plastic could just sink. And then by tuning the model to the amount of plastic that was released in the ocean and the amount of plastic that we knew was floating on the surface of the ocean, we found that indeed only 1% of or less of all the plastic was at the surface of the ocean. And the rest, and this is a logarithmic axis, do note, 99% of it or so was lost. And lost here meant sinking into the deep ocean. So in this model, assuming that all the plastic sinks, we indeed find that all the plastic sinks. Now, Laurent Le Breton, a very good friend of mine, he took a similar approach, but with the same kind of idealized model, but with different processes in there. And what he specifically looked at was the connection between the shoreline and the open ocean. So he looked at the connection and the transport between the open ocean and the shoreline. So essentially his assumption was that a lot of the plastic would have been beached. And in his model, again tuning it to the same kind of data, he found indeed that most of the plastic, and look at the axis here, by far most of the plastic was on the shoreline. And only a very, very little bit of the plastic was offshore. So really, we can find both of those. We can find both that most of the plastic is on the seafloor, 99% or so of it, or that 99% or so of it is on coastlines, if we use an idealized model. Now, a few months ago, a PhD researcher in my group, he's been working very hard on trying to combine both methods, both the sinking and the coastlines, and combine that into one model. So Michael Kaandorp, he worked on this analysis where focusing purely on the Mediterranean for now, because the Mediterranean is a much smaller basin. We've got lots of data there, lots of observations, better handles also on what the sources of the plastic exactly are. He tried to estimate, knowing the sources, which you see here in terms of the rivers, the fishing intensity, and the mismanaged plastic waste from the coastlines around the Mediterranean, estimating where most likely the plastic sunk. And it is far too detailed and too advanced a paper to just present here in a few minutes. But the gist of it is that he used a Bayesian framework to try and estimate parameters for beaching and for sinking, different sinking, and also for how the different sources are related. So population versus river and fisheries versus river. And when he tuned the model, so the red here is the Bayesian prior, if you know what that kind of thing is. The black is the posterior, so what the model actually presents you. Then he found this. This is his map of where most likely plastic has beached around the Mediterranean and where most likely plastic has sunk around the Mediterranean in brown. Now, of course, if you have a map like this, then you can sum it all up. And somewhat miraculously, I guess, or coincidentally, what he found is that roughly half of the plastic has sunk and roughly half of the plastic has beached, at least in the Mediterranean. So we now have three answers. The idealized model that all the plastic is sunk, the idealized model that all the plastic is beached, and this somewhat more sophisticated model in the Mediterranean only, where it is a bit of a 50-50. I would say we still really don't know. And I think that the big problem is that we just don't have the data. We don't have enough data to tune these models. We need more data and we need better data. So I was really happy that a few weeks ago, Matthias Egger and his team at the Ocean Cleanup, that they published this data set, which I think is the first data set where between Hawaii and California, they sampled the entire 2 kilometers water depth of the ocean. So here in red at the surface is the garbage patch. That is the very, very high concentration of plastic right at the surface. But they found that even below that, there's quite high concentrations of plastic already. Now, the total amount of plastic in this area below the garbage patch is roughly the same as the amount floating on the surface of the garbage patch. So here, for the first time, we have a bit of a better feeling for how much plastic is in the water column, at least. Although, mind you, this, of course, is only the water column up to 2 kilometers depth. We have no idea still what happens below this. There's no data. It's a bit the oceanographers' way of saying, here be dragons, right? This is terra incognita for all of us, how much plastic is right down here. So we don't have the data, but we also don't really have a good feeling for what the processes are. What type of physical oceanography do we need to take into account? We've seen that plastic accumulates in these gyres in the middle of the ocean, but we don't really know how the plastic gets there. And we don't know what the role of the tides is, of the wind is, of things like Stokes drift, of windrows. All of that is completely unclear. So we're working hard with a big group to try and get a bit of a sense out of this and to tear apart what are the different processes that actually impact plastic floating on the surface of the ocean. And this is a review paper that we wrote out of a SCORE working group that came out earlier this year. Now, if you're interested in all of this, I'd like to make a short advertisement. We have 4 positions open in my team to work exactly on these kind of questions. Where is all the plastic? How does it go? So if you want to join us, then have a look at this website. Most of the positions close this weekend. There's postdoc position, PhD position. So feel free to have a look if you want. And if you think you can, if you want to have a try in this field, and if you think you can contribute to the work that we're doing. So that's my own expertise about physical oceanography, about how the ocean currents move all this plastic around. And as I've shown you, hopefully, there's a lot of still unknowns there. But I think that if you step a little bit backward, a bit further back, and if we ask ourselves, well, why would we even care about all this plastic in the ocean? Then I think that there's even more unknowns. Because I think that we care about the ocean because the plastic does harm in the ocean. We care about the ocean because things live there, and we care about plastic there because it may harm it. But the harm of the plastic is still not really well understood. There was a paper that came out 2 years ago out of the UK, a group in the UK, where they did a review analysis of the ecotoxicology of all this plastic. So people often, they think, if they think about plastic interacting with marine life, they think about giant whales like this. But of course, there aren't very many whales in the ocean. There's many, many, many more tiny organisms. So what Burns and Boxall did is they looked at, in the literature, at what concentrations of particles per liter, so how many plastic particles you have to feed to an organism before they die. And that is here, this red band for different organisms in the ocean. And then they went into the ocean and they looked at, well, what is the typical concentration of plastic in the areas where these organisms actually live? And that is the green band over here. Now what you see is that the difference between the two is a factor 10 to the 8 to 10 to the 6. So that's 1 million to 100 million times lower concentrations in the ocean than what we know from the literature actually kills them. Now, of course, you can say a lot about this because death is a rather extreme endpoint. Maybe it's a bit too extreme to think about actually organisms dying, as that should be the point at which we start worrying about plastic in the ocean. Of course, we should worry before that. We should also worry once organisms can't reproduce anymore, when they have difficulty feeding. All these other endpoints are relevant too, and they're probably far below these concentrations. But still, the fact that we don't really know actually where that happens, because it is much harder to measure when an organism is actually impacted without dying, that says something. We don't know what the harm is to these organisms on the concentrations that they see in the ocean right now. And then this is only the plastic itself. But the story complicates gravely and vastly once you start asking the thing about all the other toxins that are in the ocean. Either toxins that are on the plastic itself or toxins that are already in the ocean in very low concentrations. Now, many of these toxins, they actually get absorbed by plastic because they're hydrophilic. So concentrations of things like DDT and PCBs on plastic particles can be 10,000 or 100,000 times higher than in the water. these plastic particles essentially become sponges of toxins in the ocean. So you could argue, well, okay, so that is then the problem of plastic. That is just an enormous amount of toxic material. And if animals eat that, that would be problematic. But even that is a little bit more complicated than it sounds. So this is a paper by Bart Koolmans again from his group, where he did a review of all the ways that toxins can actually interact with, the toxins in plastic can interact with organisms, a fish drawn here, swimming upward for some reason. And one of the pathways is, of course, that a fish eats a piece of plastic, it has toxins in it, and those toxins leach out in the gut. And that is then probably detrimental to the fish. That is a pathway that we would often think about. But there's another pathway where actually there is already a bit of toxin in the gut of the fish because of the water it swims around in. And the plastic actually absorbs that toxin in the gut. So essentially now the fish is getting a detox by eating some plastic. Now then there are just the direct release of plastic, the uptake of plastic, the food prey organization. There's many, many different of these pathways. But the point is that we don't really know which of the ones, how important they all are, or how they relate to each other. So just simply saying that toxins in plastic are bad when fish eat them is a little bit too simplistic. And we need much more data about that. And that is thinking that at least all these particles are plastic. Last week, a really, really interesting paper came out by Giuseppe Suaria from Italy, where he spent an awful lot of time on a ship going literally around the world on a few different legs of a gigantic cruise, all around Antarctica, up the Atlantic Ocean, and all the time taking sampling with his nets and other ways for plastic in the ocean. And specifically what he looked at is fibers, the kind of tiny fibers that many of us have found in our nets, in our analysis, and that we've often discarded because we really didn't know what those fibers are. Now, Giuseppe had a very close look of those, and he found that actually most of the fibers were cellulosic or animal. They were cotton, they were wool. And only, well, maybe a bit more than 10% in the Southern Ocean, but in all of the other basins, less than 10% of the fibers were actually synthetic. Less than 10% of them were plastic. So we see all these fibers in the ocean. We find enormous amounts of fibers, but not very many of them are plastic. So the question then really is, well, what does this mean? What are these fibers then? Are they as harmful, or are they harmful? How does that relate? We really don't know. But let's assume that plastic in the ocean is not good. Let's assume that at least we have the precautionary principle, and that's better to have an ocean without plastic than an ocean with plastic in it. Then the last question, and maybe the most important question, is, of course, what do we do about it? How do we deal with this? The amount of plastic at the moment in the ocean is an atrocity. We should be ashamed of it. But it is probably not that much yet. We don't know of many species of organisms that have gone extinct because of plastic. That's good news in some ways. But on the other hand, the future is much bleaker. Because, and this is a paper by Geyer et al., where they did an estimate of the amount of plastic waste generated. And as you can see, over time, in the coming 30 years, that is only going to increase exponentially. By the year 2050, according to these projections, we're producing almost 5 times as much plastic waste as we are producing now. And what's even worse is that still most of this plastic, all the way to the year 2050, most of it will just be discarded. Not all of that ends in the ocean, but this is a plastic that is not properly managed. Our recycling and our incineration is really, really lagging behind. Most of the plastic is not properly taken care of and will not be taken care of in the future. And this is a global problem, because here, so this is a paper by Laurent Le Breton again, and another paper where he very carefully mapped where all the plastic enters the ocean. From rivers, from coastlines, all of these areas are where plastic ends up in the ocean. So this is really something that we have to do together as a global community. And if you would ask me, what do we do about this plastic? Well, it's pretty simple. It's just turn off the tap. Make sure that no more plastic ends up in the environment. So this was for a GESAM working group, of which I was also a part a few years ago, where we estimated, well, what is happening with all the plastic? And we came up with 3 levels. The top level is the economy. That is where we use plastic, where plastic actually has an economic value, where it has a use, where it is meaningful to use it, right? And it goes around and around and around. Then some of that plastic ends up in society as final consumption by citizens. It's not really super useful there. It doesn't have an economic use. I often think here about the plastic bags that are on our kitchen cupboards. They're rather useless, but they're also not that harmful yet. The real problem is, of course, on the bottom level, the environment, both the terrestrial environment and the marine environment. That is where the plastic does a harm. So really, if you want to fix the plastic problem, then it's fairly simple. We just have to close the gaps. We have to stop plastic going from this level to this level. And that, in the end, is all about waste management. I think that is where most of the solutions should be. Either technologically or legislatively, that is where we should make sure that plastic stays here and doesn't end up here. So, to conclude then, those are the 3 open questions, I think, that are out there and that I really encourage you all to start working on if you want to join this field. Where is all the plastic? Only 1% or less of all the plastic has actually been mapped. We can point on a map where it is. How much harm does this plastic actually do? Can we really quantify in how much peril entire species are and how close to extinction they are? And then the final question, what can we do about it? And that is, I guess, where us scientists, we can't do it anymore. We have to do this together with society, with stakeholders, with legislation, and with essentially all of humanity. Thank you. And of course, I couldn't have done it without all of them. So thank you very much, people.
The first question that has had the most likes is, how do you see the potential of Earth observation satellites, either optical or radar, in sampling the plastic data?
Yeah, so great question about Earth observation and the potential of Earth observation to actually sample plastic. So there's a few angles to this, right? So first of all, Earth observation data would probably only be able to map plastic at the surface of the ocean. Now, that is important, but I don't think it's the really, really big question. As I've told you, almost the only data that we have is plastic off the surface of the ocean. So just to improve the maps is also always useful, but I think that it would not help us figuring out how much plastic is, for instance, in the deep sea. It could be very interesting to start mapping plastic on coastlines. And if Earth observations or in coastal areas, that is where Earth observation could certainly help. But I think that it will be challenging. A lot of papers have come out in the past, and especially in the last few months. Lauren Bierman from PML has done a very nice paper examining whether the satellites that are out there, how good they are already in mapping plastic. And the tricky thing is, well, if you have a really big piece of really clean plastic that is dry, then yes, you can see it. Shungu Garabawa has also shown that. But as soon as either the plastic is much smaller, or it is wet, or it is biofouls, so things start growing on it, then it becomes really, really challenging. So for sure, it would be nice to have satellites. It would be nice to have more observations. But I don't think it would be the one-all solving thing.
Great, thank you. So the next question, so for those of you who have not yet figured it out, there's this Slido website that you can go to, and then the hashtag is OPW for Ocean Plastic Webinars, and you can ask your questions there. You can also click on like for questions that you also would like the answer to, so that we have the top questions for Erik with the most likes on it. So the second most liked question is from Etienne Gros. So how long does it take for plastic to reach the garbage patch? Do we have data on the plastic composition depending on the area?
Yeah, it's a good question. So how long does it take plastic to reach the garbage patch? Well, so in the simulations that we've done, we see that it takes 3, 4, 5 years or so. Now, what's interesting, and that is one of the points that Laurent Le Breton from the Ocean Cleanup keeps coming back to, is that much of the plastic that they find in the garbage patch, so when they go out there to sample plastic there, is much, much older than that. They find plastic that's 30, 40, 50 years old. And they don't find very much younger plastic. So the question is then, well, what does that mean? What does that mean to the total budget of plastic in the ocean? That is why Laurent and his team have come up with this model that suggests, as I've shown, that most of the plastic is actually on the coastline. But yeah, in short, it takes a few years or so for the plastic to end up in the garbage patch.
Great, thank you for that. The next question is from Anonymous. Are there any kind of bacteria that can decompose the plastic into organic fibers?
Yeah, good question. Whether there are bacteria that can already decompose the plastic. We think so. We think that it is actually possible. Wait a second. Helge Niemann, who is a researcher at the Royal Netherlands Institute for Ocean Research, NIOS. He is doing analysis where he breeds different types of bacteria and see whether they can ingest plastic. And it seems that is indeed in the ocean already possible. We know that plastic can be digested by bacteria on land. In the ocean, likely, but we have no idea to what extent. And we don't know, again, the question of where is all the plastic. I don't think anybody knows how much of the plastic could then already have been degraded by bacteria by now.
Right, thanks for that clarification. The next question comes from Carsten Lehman. And the question is, ocean and beach cleanups are all over the media. Hearing your focus on prevention, turning off the tap, how do you judge the value of these cleanups?
Well, I'm certainly not against cleanups. And actually, I think that beach cleanups in particular are very, very effective. Depends a bit where you do the beach cleanups, but especially if you're on beaches that have a lot of flux, so a lot of plastic going onto the beach and then back into the ocean again, then cleaning up the plastic from the beach, of course, effectively removes plastic from the ocean. Because if you take it away from the beach, then it can't go back into the ocean again. Now, we don't know very well how much plastic beaches, let alone that we know how much plastic actually flushes back, is recaptured into the ocean. But that, I think, is a very cost-effective way of removing plastic from the ocean. Plus, there was fantastic work by Kaylee Wiles and Sabine Powell out of Exeter, where they showed that cleaning up beaches is actually good for your mental health. It's actually better if you're on a beach. So taking a beach walk is already good for your mental health, but it's even better if you also clean up the beach at the same time. So not only does cleaning up a beach take plastic out of the ocean, it also helps your mental health.
That's great. Right, so let's move on to the next question. Also an anonymous one. You talked about the last 99% plastic either deep in the sea or at the beach. Are these estimates on how much ends up in nanoplastics, i.e. too small to measure?
No, we don't have any estimate of how much is too small to measure. People have just about started actually being able to measure the nanoplastics. Now, the way, of course, these models and these estimates work is that on the one hand, we have an estimate of what the sources are. On the other hand, we have some way of figuring out how the ocean works and the processes govern it. And then we have the observations. And we need all these three ingredients to get to a model that predicts where the plastic is. So as long as we don't have the observations, there's really no way that we can say anything about how much plastic is too small to measure. And really, I wouldn't even begin to put a number on that.
Right. Well, the next one is maybe a bit more of a biologically focused question, but how can we tell a species die of plastic with toxins, ingestion, or environmental toxins? So yeah, this might be one for more.
Yeah, good question. I am not an ecotoxologist. I'm not really a biologist even. I don't know how you would tell the difference between dying from the toxins in plastic or the toxins in the water around you. I mean, in lab, the problem a bit is that all of this is easy in labs, right? All of this is easy if you have an aquarium and you put organisms in your aquarium, a mussel or a tiny fish or so, and you start feeding it. That's all controlled. Then you can do that. The challenge is then to put that into to relate that to what's happening in the real ocean. That is difficult, and that is, I think, what needs lots more attention and much more focus from ecotoxologists. But I've a good friend of mine. She's so Lonneke IJsseldijk. She's a whale pathologist, and she studies the amount of plastic in stranded whales here in the Netherlands. And she sees a lot of whales that are dead with a stomach full of plastic. But she once told me that even that, we don't really know whether the animal died because of the plastic, or whether it was already a sick or a weak animal that couldn't chase a fish anymore and started eating plastic just because it wanted something to eat, and plastic doesn't swim away. So even finding a dead whale on a beach with a stomach full of plastic, which you see a lot in the media, doesn't actually mean that that whale died because it eats plastic.
Right. Yeah. Thanks for that. So the next question is slightly more general. I guess, how is it possible, or how does plastic end up in the ocean from landfills?
Good question. How does plastic end up in the ocean from landfills? I don't think anybody knows. There are landfills and landfills, first of all, right? I mean, and there's 100 million ways probably that plastic ends up in the ocean. So first of all, through rivers. Laurent, in his paper, found that a lot of the plastic actually ends up in the ocean through rivers. So I think that rivers are a major source of plastic. And that if a landfill is somehow near a river, and it can be even a tiny river that then goes into a bigger river, it slowly, finally flushes out into the ocean. But it can also be more direct. I once had a meeting with somebody who ran an NGO on doing beach cleanups on the island of Cyprus. And she told me that during the beach cleanups that they did there, they found a lot of plastic from Lebanon on the beaches. And as they found that, it has Lebanese writing on it, and of course Lebanon is just across in the Mediterranean Ocean, not that far, so quite nearby. They wondered, like, why does all this plastic end up here on Cyprus? They went to Lebanon, and they found that there was this giant, what's called waste garbage dump, a giant garbage dump right next to the beach in Lebanon. So the solution was very simple. Just build a wall between the garbage dump and the beach. And suddenly far less plastic actually ended up on the island on Cyprus too. So sometimes it's as simple as that. That's also waste management, right? That there's poorly managed garbage dumps that just can be slightly better managed by building a wall between the actual garbage dump and the beach.
Thanks for that. Yeah, the case study with Cyprus, for sure. It's a very complicated, very complex to understand how they get from the landfills to the ocean. Yeah. So one of the other questions that we have on Slido is from Althea Mountford. Do you think that a truly plastic-free society is something that we could or should aspire to?
Well, thanks, Althea. You know, I think that, so this is not a scientific question anymore. So this is a question of political belief, of value system. I'm happy to answer it though, but I don't think that I have any more right or any more any more foundation in my answer than any of you have. I personally don't think that we should ban plastic altogether. I think that plastic is a useful material, that it has done us a lot of good, that it is reducing carbon emissions in some ways, because it is either prolonging shelf life of materials or it is reducing transportation emissions. So in that sense, I'm not per se against plastic. I'm against useless plastic that is just there, that is too much packaging, that is over packaging. I am for reusing, of course. And I am mostly thinking that really the waste management system is the key intervention point, where it would be most effective to stop plastic getting into the ocean. You know, I've once said in an interview that I would love at some point to live in a society again where I could go to the supermarket and without any moral guilt, I would just buy a plastic bag again. I would just use all the plastic bags that are there, and I wouldn't have to worry, because I would know that whatever happens with that plastic bag, it will never, never, ever end up in the environment. Now, that would be the society that I want, not the society where I could never use plastic anymore.
Yeah, that's I think something that a lot of us would love to go back to. Right, so I think we have another 5 minutes left, so I'd like to just finish with Lilia Katmulina, her question, and then we'll close off this session. So the last question is there any research on the capacity of the ocean to deal with the plastic, as the ocean is a complex system which can adjust and use the stuff coming into it?
Yeah, well, so that's a fantastic question, and I think a really appropriate question to end this session on World Ocean Day. Now, the ocean can do anything, right? The ocean is just a gigantic pool of water, and the plastic there, yeah. If the ocean was lifeless, if there was nothing actually living in the ocean, then I think we wouldn't actually be sitting here, because then why would we even care about all the plastic in the ocean? So the question is, can the ecosystems in the ocean, can they deal with the plastic? And we don't know. We don't know to what extent ecosystems can handle this. We don't know, as we've said before, whether bacteria can start ingesting, eating this away. We don't know how quickly bacteria can adapt. We don't know how much pressure the plastic is putting on the oceans. But what we do know is that the oceans are already under pressure. They are under pressure from climate change. They are under pressure from overfishing. They are under pressure from noise pollution and all the other activities that we are doing on the ocean. And on top of that is this plastic. And even if it is by itself not harmful yet, then I think that it could very well be an extra pressure, and it could create even more harm. And that alone, because we value the organisms and the ecosystems that live in the ocean, that alone is enough to really want to stop all this plastic getting into the ocean in the first place.
I think that's a great place to conclude the session. And there are a few more questions, but I'm sure you can look at them later and answer them one by one if you wish. But I'd also just like to thank the other organizers of the Ocean Plastic webinars. It's taken a while to get everything running, and we're really excited that now it's working. And apologies for all the glitches, and hopefully by next month that's all going to be fixed. But yeah, I just wanted to thank. So we're a group of 4 right now. So that's me, Delphine Lavelle. Then we've got Audrey Hasson from L'Océan in Paris, Takunda Chitaka from the University of Cape Town in South Africa, and Ryota Takajima from Jamstack in Japan. And yeah, we're hoping to open up have a coordinator that's also in the US or in the Americas. And yeah, we'll hopefully be able to change the time so that it can help for time zones, for different time zones. And yeah, I think that's about it. We have put the how you can join our mailing list so that you can get all the information for the next talks on the YouTube channel. It's also on our website, and I just put our website's link on the YouTube channel. And you can also join us on Twitter and follow all our posts there. So I think that's it. If there's nothing else that you would like to add, Erik, then we can close this session for today.
Yes, happy World Oceans Day.
Yes, and thank you so much for yes, thanks so much for joining us and for your lovely talk.
Thank you all. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Great. Bye-bye.